So I've just sketched, perhaps at too much length, some of the aspects of disability under neoliberal regimes, and in some ways because I think there is such a great deal of work to do in this area, and I think also because some of these topics aren't as widely familiar outside the specialist disciplines as they would be. And I think this is significant because when you look at some of the disciplines, health disciplines, rehabilitation sciences, even transportation, a range of other disciplines, there's actually a fair bit of work on mobility and disability, but there's not a lot of critical disability studies work. That engagement's starting. You would perhaps have a better sense of the take-up of mobility's work across some of these disciplines, but it seems to me the three areas should and need to come together more. So in what kind of remains, I want to just talk a little bit about then mobile communication kind of research, and I'll just aware that I'm probably going far too slowly, and also that it is exceedingly dull to watch these kind of talks perhaps on a video screen.
So if you talk about 5 to 8 more minutes, then we'll have some time for discussion too.
All right, that's great. People will fall face down in their coffee for too long. So I suppose the first thing I wanted to observe is that with the rise of mobile communications comes in one register a kind of rise of when people talk about communications rights, which is a new concept in its own right, to talk about mobility as something that they might claim. So for instance now, in universal service policy and communications, people say, well, you know, everyone should have the right to a telephone, or the household should have the right to a telephone. Increasingly this talk of the right to internet, perhaps broadband internet, and people also wanting to say, well, what about the right to a mobile phone? There's some mobility rights in that. Okay, so what I'm interested in developing further in terms of thinking through the intersection between disability and communicative mobility is the sort of consideration of the histories, what's in the subtitle of my paper, the histories, materialities and futures. And so if we look at the introduction of the first and second generation mobile phone, from about the mid-80s to about 2005s, what we see is that it brings new kinds of communicative mobilities to new groups of people with disabilities. There's not a lot of study of this at all. It passes under the radar in many respects, but it's certainly there. When it starts to be discussed, we see particularly examples of text messaging. And so one of the celebrated cases is the domestication of text messaging by deaf communities in innovative ways to offer communicative abilities they didn't previously have with either telephone or early mobile phones. Although they did have with a specific technology that's often called text telephones or TTYs, teletypewriters. We see in this sort of early years of mobile phones, also particularly in the 90s actually, the emergence of screen readers and accessibility of operating systems, Nokia phones played a big role here, allowed blind users to create new cultures of use of mobile phones. At the same time as we see these new terrains, as it were, these new possibilities that are opening up, we also see exclusions really introduced or redoubling. And a famous example in the early mobile phones is the second generation digital mobile phones actually were a bit of a setback initially for people who used hearing aids because the inductive coupling with the telephone system was lost. And we see in these, there was a push towards miniaturization here, which is something that's been picked up and taken up in the mobilities literature, has a sort of dual character or cuts both ways because it raises accessibility issues. The smaller the mobile phones are more difficult to use. And finally, to just note that cost and affordability are ongoing users. So this is a kind of first phase around mobile phones that I want to think further about. Then a second phase is the rise of smartphones. So initially we see, so I'm talking the 2007 period, the launch of the iPhones. Initially, they're launched without accessibility features. The Mac operating systems weren't ported. And after some protests and delays, these were introduced to popular acclaim. And tablet computing emerges as a flexible platform for many people with disabilities. The apps ecosystem offers a platform for accessibility software innovation, so that becomes important. There's this kind of talk, a discourse of the iPad as a revolution for people with disabilities, which is something we certainly could take with a grain of salt, although there's been real gains here. We also see the rise of mobile internet, especially the social media on mobile platforms and location-based media. And there's an intense and very diverse take-up by communities and users with disability across platforms, big commercial platforms like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. Second Life is quite a number of others that scholars are beginning to study. So I think this is an interesting second phase of kind of new developments in communicative mobilities and disability. A third phase, in some ways the phase we're in, or a third stage one could distinguish, is a phase, I've just called it here, after mobile media. But disability is a key thread across various information communication technology, digital technology, agglomerations or assemblages or platforms that have a mobile thread to them. And this is what I'm currently working on in my current project. And I'll just list a number of them here, knowing that different people are working in these across the mobilities field. Driverless cars and assisted driving. So there's a clue here, for instance, in the Google driverless car, in the way it's promoted and designed with drivers with vision impairments in mind. Smart homes, which is a topic with a long genealogy, and many people with disabilities have been living in smart homes for a long time. Homes with sensors, homes that have got a lot of high technology in them. But there's new developments in these. Wearable computers, Google Glass being one of these. Google explicitly engaged disability communities and users in interesting ways. And there's a kind of contradictory set of discourses here around wearable computers. Now people are discussing Apple Watch. And a fourth area that I'm, find very interesting is 3D printers. The kind of cultures that what people call the maker cultures, the cultures of innovation around 3D printing. In some ways, these are quite different, but I think there's this interesting thread in which disability goes across this. And then I think one of the things it requires us to do, which I think harks back to what Kim and Leslie were saying this morning, and many were saying yesterday, obviously, about bringing together transportation, bringing together communication, bringing together urban design, bringing together areas of specialism in either disability technology or I think around gerontology and older people and technologies as well that have been quite distinct. Now, this kind of, the way I've sort of divided up and talked about the stages here, I think is in some ways a bit simplistic. So towards the end, I've just had a bit of coda to think through about part of what this, I think now our present conjuncture, as Stuart Hall might have said, is about thinking about the alternative histories. And so I think there's a really interesting sense in which disability suggests a real complex, distinctive mixture of mobilities, infrastructure and affordances. And I liked this notion of mobility affordances. And I think we now have the opportunity to think past and beyond the mobile phone in thinking about the histories of mobilities and mobility affordances and technology that shape communicative mobility. So I've done a little work myself on starting from the present about the sense in which current mobile technologies and location technologies allow blind users new ways of locating themselves in space, new ways of wayfinding. And you can see that as being something centering on the mobile phone platform. But there's actually far more complex histories and precursors to this, of which guide dogs or service animals are part of it, canes and sonar detecting technology of the 1980s and 90s where there were very interesting cultures of co-design going on. So look, I'll sort of draw my talk to a close now. As you can see, definitely under development, but I hope that's been useful contribution and addition to the conversation. Thanks very much for listening.